started out, and just to show you the interest that exists up there, because what we have done through the Children is go to your schools and speak to the schools and say, would you like this? Would you like this course? We started out with 20 schools 4 years ago. And last year we were over 800. It looks like we're going to be in 1,000 schools across the country. And if there's any indication of the interest that young people have and teachers have in this, I think that it is that. The three courses that I would talk to you about, or programs that I would talk to you about in somewhat greater detail. One is our youth entrepreneurship program, which in fact are in communities where some of the chiefs who are here today. What really happened is we started off at a reserve high school in Thunder Bay. And then we went to another school, and then Children of the Earth in Winnipeg, and then another school. And at one point, a young man came up to me, Cree, and came up to me and he said, why is it we're studying business examples from Toronto, from Montreal, from New York City? What about our own people? And, you know, the light that should have gone off at the very beginning went on. And so we asked two of our teachers to take time off and to rewrite these books totally, to bring in nothing but Indigenous examples, and to basically bring in the medicine wheel and to make these books culturally adequate, culturally appropriate to teaching business. And when we did that, the course took off like this. We're now in 46 schools across the country. Next year, we're about to have our first online course into northern communities, and thanks really to some very dedicated public servants, we're going to be in Quebec next year. So I feel very strongly about that. We're also in the process of putting together, along with OISE, the Faculty of Education at the University of Toronto, and 14 Indigenous experts, education experts. We're putting together a principals course. And the purpose of it is to enable principals on reserve to basically either learn the trade or refresh themselves in the trade. We're going to do, we'll do models, pilot projects before it starts. But the fact is that it's going to take us about 1.5 years to put this together. But essentially, what we want to demonstrate, and this is what we want to demonstrate, is that the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit can do whatever non-Indigenous Canadians can do if only they are given the instruments, if only they are given the tools of the trade. How do you deal with literacy? How do you basically embed literacy with kids who just weren't picking it up by grade 3? I called the Gates Foundation and I said to them, I would like somebody to come out and meet with you to understand the research that you've done into literacy, to see what it is that we could possibly offer. The Gates Foundation said, we'll meet you in Toronto in 2 weeks. I thought, oh my God, here's another American doesn't know where the heck Canada is. I said, I'll come out to see you. And they said, no, we'll meet with you in 2 weeks, because the best literacy turnaround program that we know of was done by the Ministry of Education in Ontario. So I called the then Minister of Education, it was Kathleen Wynne, and I said, can we borrow the program? And she said, absolutely. We went to the Peel School Board and took one of the key people who had led the program. And we then met with the chiefs and band councils of 2 communities, Kettle and Stony Point, which of course was Patrick right there, which is part of Union of Ontario Indians, and Walpole Island. And 5 years ago, we embarked upon a program working with the teachers in those 2 schools to focus on literacy on the basis that if you can't read and write by the time you finish grade 3, you will play catch up for the rest of your lives. And then we wanted to continue on to grade 6 to make sure that in fact that this would stay. The reason that I felt it was important for us to do our initiative and all of the courses that I have just talked to you about is that essentially we felt very strongly that we had to demonstrate that if you filled the gaps in, that those who say, you know, that this money isn't going to solve the problem are wrong. Money won't solve the problem, but money will give you the tools. Money will give you teachers who are adequately paid. Money will give you decent schools. Money will give you science and math labs. And so we said we want to demonstrate that if in fact there's a proper investment that goes into these schools, that they will be as good as any school and that Aboriginal students will do as well as any other student. So we began a 5-year program in terms of literacy, grades 1 to 3, and then 4 to 6. And where's Kat, the elder? Hello, elder. The elder was there when we made the announcement at the University of Toronto 2 days ago. The results of our course in those 2 schools were that in reading 1 to 3 and 4 to 6, the results were exactly on the provincial average. These students started substantially below the provincial average. And after 4.5 years in these programs, in terms of reading, they were with the provincial average. In terms of writing, they started even lower beneath the provincial average. And I'm glad to say, Patrick, that those 2 schools came up with results based on the Ontario evaluation that is superior to the provincial average in this province. Now, so let me just simply conclude with that, is don't let anybody tell me that continuous underfunding of on-reserve schools is not the answer. Don't anybody tell me that if we give the First Nations of this country on reserve the same tools that the provinces provide their schools, that they will not do as good a job, because I think we have done it, and I think if we continue to if we fund them properly, they will succeed, and they will surpass our fondest dreams. And that, in the end, is what this is all about.
Well said, Mr. Martin. There's no doubt about it in terms of that type of success, and what research continues to show is that success actually breeds more success. And when people actually start to feel and believe that success can happen, it does create a very, very different dynamic. So congratulations. It's wonderful. And you were talking before about the funding components. You were talking about things. And I just briefly also want to discuss a bit about something that you brought forth called the Kelowna Accord, and which truly represented, I think, a wonderful portal and an opportunity for dramatic change. Yet, we are where we are now. How do you feel about all this?
Every on-reserve education has been underfunded by the federal government, regardless of political party, from the beginning of time. I mean, after the residential schools met their deserved fate, thank heaven, the fact is that federal government continued to underfund those schools. And I was the Minister of Finance who put the cap on. At the time we were trying to affect the deficit. There's no doubt in my mind that the cost of that underfunding is overwhelming. And so when I became Prime Minister, I brought in the Kelowna Accord with one goal, and that is to recognize that it is not a question of comparable funding with the provinces. There's a heck of a lot more that is required than simple comparable funding. It's a great deal more. And that we were going to deal with it in one fell swoop, and that was the Kelowna Accord. We put $1.9 billion in, and we basically said at the end of that 5 years, we'll know it's not enough and we'll start to build up. And of course, as we know, that accord, the accord did not succeed. The question really, though, out of the Kelowna Accord, which I think is so important, is to recognize that how you're going to deal with this. Education, first of all, should be controlled by the First Nations. It should be controlled by the Métis, and it should be controlled by the Inuit. And why shouldn't it be? I mean, surely to God, one should understand that Indigenous people in this country love their children every bit as much as we do, and the only thing they want for them is the same opportunities we want. And I can't, you know, we take a look at the education system here, and we try as much as possible to have parents working with the educators in which to make it succeed. So why wouldn't we understand that that's what's going to happen with the First Nations? And so what we did in the Kelowna Accord is we didn't sit down and say to the First Nations or the Métis or the Inuit, here are your problems. We sat down with them and we said, what are the problems? You tell us what they are and we'll work on them. Second thing we said is, what are the solutions? You tell us what we are. We may not agree on the solutions. We'll agree with your identification of the problems, but we will work with you to solve them. But that is the only way in which we're going to arrive at a solution. The fact of the matter is we've got to recognize the reality of where sovereignty lies within First Nations. We've got to recognize that the AFN cannot speak for the 560 odd nations. In fact, it is the nations that will speak for themselves. And so in the Kelowna Accord, what we essentially said, we would negotiate for 3 months. We would talk for 3 months, and at that point, Phil Fontaine would leave. And he would go back and he would consult with the First Nations across the country. And then he would come back and he would negotiate again. And then he would go back. And at the end of 18 months, we had arrived at an understanding of the way in which we were going to work. You are not going to arrive at a solution to any of these problems unless, in fact, you understand that you've got to give people time to consult, that people have got to be able to develop their own plans. That's why the Kelowna Accord succeeded. And until we're prepared to treat the First Nations and the Métis and the Inuit as equals, we're not going to arrive at a solution to those issues. But if we do treat them as equals, if we do recognize the fundamental fact that there is a body of educators who are Aboriginal in this country who will match anybody in the land, and also Ottawa doesn't have a Department of Education, and there's not an educator in the government, for God's sake, and sometimes I think there's not an educated person. And so fundamentally, there are solutions to these issues. This is not an impossible issue to deal with. But we've just got to recognize that you have to treat people as their equal, as your equal. You cannot continue, for heaven's sakes, the basic settler domination that was established going back 300-400 years.
Yeah. It's interesting with what you're saying, and I totally subscribe to it. It's something at the CEA that we do, Mr. Martin, is sometimes we do ask the questions that people in education sometimes don't want to ask. One of the questions that we asked in the last 18 months was, what's standing in the way of change? Because we've been doing a lot of research, and my predecessor as well, Kenny Milton, had been doing work with what's standing in the way of change, but also in terms of what are you doing in school today, student intellectual engagement. And this is kind of leading up to a question here, but in our research that we've been doing, what we've noticed is that in our regular system, we're seeing increasing levels of disengagement. In other words, kids are now doing school, they know what needs to be done to get a good mark, but are they really getting the type of education that is necessary? It makes us question about it. A week after you wrote your article in the Globe and Mail just recently about your feelings about the entire issue of First Nations Indigenous education, Max Feinday wrote an article. He's the president of the University of the Saskatchewan Student Union, and he wrote in the Globe and Mail in the 18th of February, quote, "It's time for a distinct school system focused on ingenuity to exist in Canada's cities." He argues it's not simply a question of making the current system respond to Indigenous challenges, but rather create a new system. What would you think?
Well, I know Max Feinday, and he's a very bright young man, and I think there is an enormous amount in what he says. I think that if you talk to, and I had this conversation with him, it's a little strange, I must say, for me to be up here talking about when you talk to the First Nations, when there's more knowledge in the front row of this table than I could ever imagine. But as one of the things about being a politician, I'm used to speaking to people who know more than I do. The fundamental issue is this. The Indigenous people have a worldview that is different from the worldview that most of us grew up with. You and I grew up with, number one, essentially having a hierarchy. And that hierarchy had us up here, and animals there, plants and the rest of them down there. The fact is that the First Nations basically think that have a much different view. It is a holistic view that says we are all part of nature. Now, it's a very interesting thing, all right? Science that you and I both learned compartmentalizes our way. Talk to a physicist. Talk to a quantum physicist. What's a quantum physicist will tell you? He will tell you that there are no gradations, that everything is the same, that everything is moving. The fact is that modern quantum physics is in fact the Aboriginal worldview. So you can decide which one you're going to take, but the fact of the matter is, for us to impose our worldview doesn't mean we can't teach math, we can't teach science or chemistry or anything else, but for us to impose our worldview on a people who may well have, certainly in terms of the environment, a superior worldview, makes absolutely no sense. And those kids, and what Max Fine Day is saying is, wait a minute, I grew up with my worldview. And how do you expect me to come out of my community and go into grade 1 or 2 and have your worldview presented in front of me? Do you not think I'm not going to be confused? Do you not think I'm not going to have trouble understanding what it is that you're saying to me? And that's the reason why there's no doubt in my mind that, in fact, Indigenous education requires Indigenous teachers within an Indigenous context. And I don't think it means that we're not going to be able to have an education system that is the same as ours. I mean, you hear people consistently say, you know, that the Aboriginal worldview presents a view on which you cannot build a modern system of thought. All right? Well, I'll tell you something. Read Genesis and tell me if that isn't a worldview that isn't on which we built a consistent system of thought. And I'm not so sure that the scientific validity of Genesis is one that would hold up to that much interest, that much examination. But don't quote me.
I wouldn't worry about that. Yeah, it's before you were talking about the Gates Foundation, and something that was very interesting. Bill Gates addressed his foundation in December. And at that time, they had been doing a review of their investment in the entire process of trying to eradicate malaria and dengue fever. And what they noticed was that they had very, very few positive results, less than what he had anticipated. And he used the word 4 times in his speech, I was naive. And what he talked about was the importance of identifying not only the solutions, but the barriers at the same time, that you can't do one without ignoring the other. Would you feel it's the same for the Indigenous issue in Canada in education?
In what way?
In the sense that if we try to be solutions-based, we've got to also be able to address the other endemic issues that are there, that we can try to find a way in which we can bring this together.
You mean the social problems?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I don't think there's any doubt that you cannot separate the problems of education from the problems of society. You can't do this for the First Nations, as an example, any more than you can do it for people in the East End of Montreal. I mean, the fact is that we are what we are, and we are where we come from, and we've got to address those solutions. But I'll go back to this announcement that was made by Carlana in terms of what happens when you give teachers a different way of teaching literacy. The kids in those 2 schools came from people who have problems and who have successes. They came from schools that were substantially below the provincial average 5 years ago, and they are now way above. And so, yes, you've got to deal with all of those other problems. But that doesn't mean that if you give the First Nations, the Métis and the Inuit, the tools, and they've got to be tools, by the way, that they choose. When we went into this pilot project in the 2 schools, we didn't go in and basically say, here's what you're going to do. The first couple of years were essentially working with the teachers to make sure that what we were doing was going to work. And there was an evaluation. Carolina did an evaluation year after year after year as to the methods that were put in place. So that, in fact, we knew that we weren't trying to take something from downtown Bay Street and put it into either one of those communities. And everything was accepted by the principals, everything was accepted by the teachers. That's what you got to do.
Well, it's very much clear. It's very clear in the sense of when you're looking at in terms of the work that you've done, Carlan, in the initiative, it is something that we call deep learning. In other words, focusing on trying to make sure that the professional development for the teachers is not just the superficial, it's not just the one-off, it's not just a couple visits, here it is, but rather the deep learning component. And certainly you're proving the results coming out of that. That's, again, another model for that type of progress. One last question here that I've got to ask, and that is, because you referred to it in a number of occasions, and even when you received the Sloan Medal, you're talking about the demographics and this whole demographic issue of the Indigenous population in Canada, and the fact that this is a fastest growing demographic. What words of wisdom or caution would you like to bring out today to us about this issue?
Well, all right, I'm going to answer your question, but before I do, I mean, I think I can give you a Minister of Finance answer to that. But I want to say that this is, and I think clearly the Minister of Finance answer is conclusive. But I don't want to take away from the moral issue. If there were no economic answer to what you've raised, if there were no hard-edged reasons for providing reasonable education, my own view is that the moral issue is by far the most important. No country in the era in which we live, when you see the challenges to our institutions and our beliefs that come from so many parts of the world, and in fact within ourselves, no country can withstand the pressures that will come from their young if there is not a moral weight to what they are doing. And I think that part of the problem that we face is that over the last 20, 30 years, we've lost a lot of that those moral values. And so if what I'm about to say was not the case, I still think that essentially recognizing that the education and the health care, by the way, of young Indigenous Canadians is the single most important moral issue we face. Now, to go to your issue. We are an aging population. Take a look at that picture that was up there before. We are an aging population. The youngest, the fastest growing segment of our population are Aboriginal Canadians. Province of Saskatchewan, by the time year 2020, the majority of students will be Aboriginal. 2016, the majority number of students going into grade 1 will be Aboriginal. I don't know if Mr. Farthing is here, but I believe that in the province of Manitoba, over 33% of the students in 2 years will be Aboriginal. These are huge numbers. And that if we are not prepared to invest massively in the fastest growing segment of our population, then we're not going to have an economy. And that's just black and white. We will not have an economy. You cannot have an economy in which your young have fallen behind. And so much of the momentum is against the First Nations, against the Métis, against the Inuit, in terms of where they're going. That momentum is happening because of underfunding of healthcare, because of the underfunding of welfare, because of underfunding of education. And we as a nation have to face up to this. And let me tell you, I know a little bit about deficits. Well, and so governments are going to tell you, wait a minute, we can't afford to do that all of a sudden. We can't afford to do it. That's really dumb economics. The fact of the matter is, when somebody makes an investment, right, they don't look we're in the Bank of Montreal. I've been to the Bank of Montreal, all right? Not always successfully, but I've been to the Bank of Montreal. Essentially, what does a bank look to when they make you the investment? They look to the return on the investment. It's not the size of the investment that counts. It's the return on the investment. So the return, there is not a greater return on investment than the investment that is put into education. Because what does it offset? What's the cost of incarceration? What's the cost of lost productivity? What's the cost if you can't get people who are going to come along and innovate and be entrepreneurs, or people who are going to be your workforce, or people who are going to be your next generation of scientists? If you can't do that, you will not succeed. There are two areas where the underinvestment is absolutely going to cripple us. One of them is education, and the other one is healthcare. And we're facing that right now, and it's about time we begin to understand some pretty basic economics.
Hey,